What purpose does tradition serve to an artist? When we talk about tradition, it's usually about yearly activities families partake in to celebrate the holidays, or religious customs and ideas shared within a community. In my years of study as a composer, I've noticed that my composition classes are based on the tradition of either counterpoint, theory, or orchestration. But why do we maintain these traditions? Why do I have to learn 18th century counterpoint as a 21st century composer? Postmodernist thinking would have us believe that tradition is not only useless, but maybe even harmful. I reject this idea completely, for I see something incredibly valuable in tradition, as both a composer and as a listener of music. As an artist, I believe tradition allows us to communicate with our audience, and it allows us to draw connections between ourselves and the past. When someone listens to music, there are certain expectations we have. For instance, every time we hear a dominant at the end of a phrase, we expect it to go to the tonic. Whether or not that expectation is met is how a composer can communicate with his or her audience. Tradition also gives the composer the opportunity to think critically and be creative with how he or she approaches their craft. So, to explore how tradition can serve an artist, I want to analyze Stravinsky's first movement of his Septet. This piece is regarded by many as his transitional piece from neoclassicism, which is heavily rooted in the tradition of classical and Baroque music, to serialism, which is a new musical tradition that started in the early 20th century. I see this piece as an amalgamation of old and new traditions with a Stravinskyan twist, which is why I believe this is a perfect example as to how a composer can employ tradition. For starters, I want to take a look at how he uses sonata form and then how he approaches harmony and counterpoint through the use of serial techniques. Now, I will be taking a look at Stravinsky's Septet, just the first movement, in order to look at how Stravinsky uses tradition and innovates against that tradition by the way he uses sonata form and harmony. So first, we need to understand what sonata form is. So sonata form is just a way to organize music in such a way that it creates balance and clarity, and it is made up of three large sections: an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. So the exposition of the sonata form is made up of two main parts: the primary thematic zone and the secondary thematic zone. Both zones contain the main themes, motifs, and ideas the composer will be using later on as part of the development. Now, a very important thing to point out is that the primary thematic zone is in the tonic, while the secondary thematic zone is in a completely different key. Most of the time, it's in the dominant, although it can also be in the relative minor or major, or in the parallel minor or major, or in some other mode. And the transition that's within the primary thematic zone tries to tie both of these sections together by basically modulating from the tonic into whatever the other key is. In this case, it's the dominant. And after the secondary thematic zone, or to close it off, basically, there's what we call a closing zone. Now, in between the primary and the secondary thematic zones, there's this thing called a medial caesura, and all it is just a rest. Sort of what this rest does is just indicates that we're moving on into the secondary thematic zone. So the development in a sonata form, basically all it does is that it takes the thematic material from the exposition and just starts innovating with it, right? So let's say we had a, pretty simple melody in our primary thematic zone, and then the composer is thinking about taking this melody, putting it in a different key, maybe inverts it, maybe puts it in retrograde, and decides to take a couple notes from it and make it into a fugue, right? Or into sort of an imitative counterpoint type of texture, right? As part of the development, right? That's definitely allowed. So the composer has total creative freedom to do what he or she wants in the development. Now, towards the end of the development, the composer would try to sort of start modulating to go back into the tonic, because right at the end of the development, we get the recapitulation. In the recapitulation, we get the return of the exposition. It's basically just copy and pasting the exposition, except there's a couple important differences. One of them being that the secondary thematic zone is no longer in the dominant, is now in the tonic, right? It is now in the home key. And because this happens, the transition would have to be rewritten, since it no longer has to modulate to a distant key. And as a bonus, an additional section, sort of an optional section, can be added to the recapitulation known as the coda. Where basically the coda is the very end of the piece where the composer is allowed to sort of, really conclude the piece as a whole. After reviewing the different parts that make up a sonata, now we must ask ourselves, is Stravinsky's Septet in sonata form? Kind of, but mostly yes, because if we look at this chart over here, we can notice that Stravinsky uses all three parts. We have an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. Now that we know that Stravinsky sticks to the basic building blocks of sonata form, now we need to see how he breaks the rules of sonata, how he plays around with our expectations when it comes to this form. Now, the biggest change that he did is that he removed the transition. As you notice here, after the primary theme zone is done, we jump straight into the secondary theme zone without the need of a transition. Why he does this exactly, I don't know, but it works pretty well when you listen to the music. Now, another thing to consider is the C zone, or at least here in the chart I have it written as C zone or transition, because in some of the research that I did, I've seen others call this section a transition, and they didn't point out exactly why, but my hypothesis as to maybe why they see it as a transition is because the material at the very end, like the last measure of this section, is sort of then mirrored as the introduction for the development. Because in the development, what happens is that we have sort of this subject to this sort of fugue or imitative counterpoint, and the first bar of that subject is sort of identical to the last bar of the C zone or transition, whatever you want to call it. So the way I see it, I believe is just a C zone. I don't really think of it as a transition because C zones just always come after the secondary thematic zone, right? Another detail I wanted to look at is try to find the medial caesura in this piece. And I think this idea of the medial caesura as sort of a rest is used not only after the primary theme zone, it's also used, for instance, at the end of the C zone right here. Right here, within the development, before the stretto, at rehearsal 8, there's another sort of medial caesura. Then right here, right before the recapitulation, another medial caesura. I'm assuming Stravinsky really liked the idea of a medial caesura, the sort of little tiny one beat section that just, puts the music to a halt, I guess. And maybe wanted to expand that to not only be in between the primary theme and secondary thematic zone, but also be within other sections of the piece. So before I look into what Stravinsky does in each subsection, I wanted to point out one last thing. That thing being, what does he change in the recapitulation? So, if we look at the exposition and the recapitulation, it's pretty much all the same, except the differences start at rehearsal 10, or one measure at rehearsal 10. Where at rehearsal 10, we enter in the dominant, but then the chord goes down by a major second, and then everything after that is just below a major second. So if the first measure right here was in an E chord, the next chord would sort of be in D, right? Then everything else after would follow. Besides that, there aren't any huge differences. Another difference is one measure before 13. Since we're not transitioning into the development, Stravinsky sort of recomposes that last measure, and I think he takes out a measure to then just lead us into the coda instead. So now I'm going to look at some of the things that Stravinsky does with his harmony and what serial techniques he uses in this movement. First things first, is this piece in A major or A minor? Because in the classical period, one thing that composers would try to do is really establish whether we're in a major key or in a minor key. In Stravinsky's case, he uses a little bit of both, right? Maybe this is playing on the idea of modal mixture. But basically what he does is that he plays around with, at least in the melody and the clarinet, with the third, and then with the accompanying parts with the notes that are different between the major and the minor modes, right? Those being the third, of course, the 6th and the 7th, right? So the 3rd is C sharp, the 6th is F sharp, and the 7th is G sharp, right? Or G natural. So G natural or G sharp, F sharp or F natural, and C sharp or C natural. So all these notes are sort of in play. Now there are other notes too. So like right here in the piano part, I see that he does use a D sharp. Maybe that's to hint at a Lydian or something. But despite, there being a lack of functional harmony, and, despite the fact that there's a lot of modal mixture or chromaticism, right, we do have a tonic of sorts. We do have a key center, that being A. So just to clarify on sort of this idea that I'm trying to portray here of tradition but innovating with tradition, Stravinsky is innovating with tradition by sort of, instead of either choosing the major or the minor mode, he kind of goes with both and tries to mash it together. And it works brilliantly. By doing this, the piece has some sort of quirky character to it, which I like, or at least I perceive it as quirky. Others might be like, oh, it's very, what's it called? It's very intellectual what he's doing, which it is. I just see sort of a silly character to it with this piece. In the secondary thematic zone, we begin with a chord played by the strings and the piano of an E minor. Indicating that we're in the dominant, maybe, because there's not that G sharp, maybe some might argue that this isn't an E dominant, but we're definitely in the 5th. We're definitely no longer in the tonic. That is for sure, right? And later in the secondary thematic zone, all he does to sort of show the different theme is very simple, and it's very serialist in nature, where he just employs the inversion of the theme played by the clarinet from the primary thematic zone. Another thing to point out is at rehearsal 2, we go back to the tonic, so A. So we sort of oddly go back into the tonic in the section that's usually in the dominant. So maybe that's Stravinsky, again, playing around with tradition and playing around with our expectations. And basically, in this part, what I love that he does is that he has this melody that sort of intertwines between the violin and the viola. Hearing it, it sounds like it's only one, player playing the whole melody, but in reality, it's sort of this melody that's sort of being shared or sort of being fought over, and it sounds pretty cool. So then here at the very end of the secondary thematic zone, we have, or at least before the closing zone, we have a cadence of sorts, which as to exactly what chord this is debatable, but I believe it to be an E major 7-9 chord. Now, in the development section, it seems like Stravinsky is employing even more serialist techniques by having this row, but it's even debatable. Maybe Stravinsky saw a similarity between, rows and the way fugues work, right? Because in a fugue, you have a subject, that has, certain notes, and then later on, as that subject comes to a close, a new subject comes in, right? But here in this section, right, one could argue that Stravinsky is using total serialism, that he's just following a row, right? Others might argue that no, it's just like imitative counterpoint, it's just a fugue, right? I'd argue that maybe it's just both. Maybe he's trying to bring the best of both worlds, right? Because unlike a fugue, where a fugue sort of, the notes that are used to do the counterpoint are based off of a chord, here it seems like the notes that Stravinsky is using are based off of a row, right? And other things to point out is that the entrance of each subject is by a fourth. So the viola enters at G, the violin enters at C, and then finally the cello enters at an F. Right, and this idea of coming in to, or at least using fourths, is sort of used again at the end of the development, right? And it also differs from what we would expect at a fugue, where in the fugue, sort of the subject enters in the tonic, the other voice would come in the dominant, and then another voice would come in the tonic, right? So where in the traditional sense, sort of the way that the subject enters is based off of the tonic-dominant relationship. In this instance, it's just based off of intervals, right? The fourths. And it works pretty well. Other things to point out is that basically how Stravinsky is able to make the development section work is that he has a strong sense of rhythm and sort of character in each subject, and later in the counter subject, each counter subject for each voice is slightly different, but they're based off of the same little fragments, right? So he has these sort of chromatic fragments or rhythmic fragments that he sort of uses in all the voices, but in different ways. He inverts some of them, he might augment some of them, and even in the way that he sort of manages with the subject of each voice, right? It's not exactly the same. Where in the viola, there's this big leap, right? While later in the violin, there isn't that leap. It's just a major second, right? So here we have the big leap of the major 9. Here we have just a stepwise of a major second. In the cello, same thing. And the cello seems like the rhythm here is either simplified or slightly augmented. So even just the tiny details of the subject sort of changes each time it comes in. But even though Stravinsky does that, you could still hear that, there's a fugue going on, that each subject sounds similar enough to at the very least seems like, there's a little bit of imitative counterpoint. Now, to end the development section, at rehearsal number 8, Stravinsky employs stretto, which is a technique common in fugues, to sort of introduce a different subject, or sort of the same subject, and each time it enters, so first it comes into violin, and then the clarinet, and then the viola, and so on and so forth, it comes in going down a fourth, right? So here we have an F, later we have a C, then in the viola we have a G, right? Then in the bassoon we have an A, Then here in the cello we have a D, an A, right? So it's going down a fourth, you could say it's going up a fifth, right? And then here we have sort of this final cadential point for the development. Then here, at the coda, at the very end of the coda, the clarinet plays the main theme again, but it's augmented, where augmentation, is another sort of serialist technique, you could say. And another thing to notice is that the melody this time is no longer ambiguous, right? It's now finally in an A minor. So Stravinsky, once again, sort of is playing around with our expectations by ending the piece in an A dominant instead of an A major or an A minor. And I think it fits pretty well with the whole character of the piece, with this quirky character where it doesn't know if it's either in major or whether it's in minor or Lydian or Phrygian, right? Or whether it's totally a sonata form or not, or whether this piece is truly a fugue or it isn't. And I think sort of this piece, although I sort of just go over some of the basic things I find interesting, and you could definitely go into further detail by yourself. What I was trying to highlight here is sort of how Stravinsky, sure, he is very tied to tradition, but by being a more contemporary composer, by there already being this established culture, and that's a very important thing to point out. There's an established culture of the sonata form and of the fugue, right? And by Stravinsky starting to break rules of those traditions and that culture, right? He's able to play around with the expectations of the audience and the musicians playing this piece, and of composers and theorists who want to take a look and analyze this piece. I hope after looking at this piece by Stravinsky that you're able to see ways that tradition can be useful to an artist. In Stravinsky's piece, despite the fact that he uses sonata form and he does use a lot of counterpoint, right? The piece doesn't have the strong sense of it being classical. Like, it doesn't have that classical sound, right? Where with a piece by Mozart or Haydn, it's pretty obvious that it's like, oh, hey, like, this is obviously from the classical period, right? And I believe the reason why is because little things like, using modal mixture, right? Not necessarily using functional harmony, sort of having these phrase lengths that are irregular, sort of give the piece a different character of sorts, right? I mean, using a lot of those serial techniques definitely gave it a different character, for sure. And it's this sort of shift in character from this classical sound to this neoclassical or serial sound, right? Is what gives the piece its charm, right? It's what makes this piece so unique and worthwhile looking into. Well, I hope you liked this video, and if you did, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Hopefully I put out some more videos like this, but normally I just put out videos of my own music and my own work. And well, thanks for listening.